At an exclusive Wall Street dinner, a billionaire hedge fund manager dismisses George Soros's legendary currency trades as pure luck. When Soros quietly sets down his fork and responds, what happens in the next 5 minutes doesn't just defend his reputation, it exposes that the critic doesn't understand the difference between gambling and calculated genius. New York City, October 1995. The Union Club on East 69th Street. The most exclusive private club in Manhattan, where old money meets new money, and both pretend they've always belonged. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over mahogany-paneled walls lined with oil, portraits of robber barons and railroad kings. The dining room smells of aged leather, Cuban cigars, and the particular confidence that comes from having more money than most countries. Tonight is different. Tonight, the club hosts its annual Masters of Finance dinner, an invitation-only gathering of the most powerful hedge fund managers, investment bankers, and financial titans in America, men who control trillions of dollars in capital. Men who can move markets with a single phone call. Men who shape global economic policy from the shadows of private dining rooms, exactly like this one. 24 seats around a massive circular table. Each place setting costs more than most people make in a month. Waterford crystal glasses catch the candlelight. Sterling silver flatware engraved with the club's crest. Bone china plates that have served titans of industry for over a century. The wine selection tonight includes bottles that cost more than luxury cars. At the head of the table sits James Morrison, the evening's host. 71 years old, patriarch of Morrison Capital, one of the oldest and most prestigious investment banks on Wall Street. His family has been managing money since the Gilded Age. His great-grandfather financed the Transcontinental Railroad. His grandfather funded the steel industry. His father helped rebuild Europe after World War II. James Morrison doesn't just have money, he has generational wealth, the kind that shapes civilizations. To his right sits George Soros, 65 years old now, wearing a simple black suit that costs more than most people's cars, but doesn't announce it. His white hair is perfectly styled, but his eyes remain sharp as a blade, constantly scanning, constantly processing information. He's been invited because he's impossible to ignore anymore. The Hungarian immigrant who broke the Bank of England. The man who made $1 billion in a single day. The refugee who became richer than the kings who once ruled his homeland. But Soros doesn't belong here, and everyone knows it. This is old money, establishment wealth, American aristocracy. Soros is new money, immigrant money, outsider money. He earned his fortune through intelligence and timing rather than inheritance and connections. The other men at this table tolerate him because his success is too spectacular to dismiss, but they don't truly accept him. He's useful for cocktail party stories about the exotic Hungarian who got lucky betting against currencies. Around the table sit titans of American finance. William Bradford III, whose family has controlled Bradford Trust for 4 generations. Charles Whitman, who inherited the largest private bank in New England. Robert Sterling, whose hedge fund manages pension money for half the Fortune 500. These are men who measure wealth in centuries, not decades. Men who see themselves as guardians of American capitalism, protectors of the natural order where breeding matters as much as brains. But there's one man who doesn't quite fit either category. Marcus Reed, 48 years old, founder and CEO of Apex Capital Management. Not old money like the others, but not foreign like Soros either. Reed built his hedge fund from nothing into a $10 billion empire in just 15 years. He's the new generation of American finance, aggressive, brilliant, utterly confident in his own abilities. He trades everything: currencies, commodities, equities, bonds, derivatives. His fund posts double-digit returns year after year. He's rich, famous, and convinced that he represents the future of investing. Reed has been watching Soros all evening, studying him like a scientist observing a rare specimen. Reed doesn't understand the reverence people show for Soros. Sure, the man made money betting against the pound, but so what? Any competent trader could have seen that the British couldn't maintain that exchange rate. It was obvious arbitrage, not genius. Reed has made similar trades dozens of times. The difference is that Soros got lucky with timing and size. Reed got rich through skill, discipline, and superior analytical ability. There's a difference between getting lucky once and building a sustainable investment process. The dinner progresses through 7 courses. Oysters from Maine, lobster bisque, Wagyu beef that melts like butter. The conversation flows between market predictions, regulatory gossip, and stories about recent deals. The wine flows even more freely, bottles that cost thousands of dollars opened like their house wine. These men casually discuss moving billions of dollars the way others discuss weekend plans. Morrison raises his glass for a toast. Gentlemen, to another profitable year. May our insight continue to reward our investors, and our courage continue to drive markets forward. Crystal glasses clink. The sound echoes through the dining room like a bell, marking another victory for American capitalism. But then something shifts. The conversation turns to legendary trades, to the stories that define careers and create legacies. Someone mentions the Hunt brothers trying to corner the silver market. Another tells the story of Jesse Livermore shorting the 1929 crash. Bradford recounts his grandfather's trade during the 1907 panic that saved 3 banks from collapse. Morrison turns to Soros. George, perhaps you'd share the story of Black Wednesday? I'm sure our younger colleagues would enjoy hearing about the day you broke the Bank of England from the horse's mouth. The table goes quiet. This is it. The legend. The trade that every finance student learns about, that every hedge fund manager dreams of replicating. The 16th of September 1992. The day one man bet $10 billion against the British pound, and won. The day George Soros made $1 billion in profit, while the UK government lost $27 billion defending their currency. The most famous trade in history. Soros sets down his wineglass, considers the request. He's told this story 1,000 times, but never quite gets used to the attention. It wasn't as dramatic as the newspapers made it seem. I simply recognize that the British commitment to the European exchange rate mechanism was mathematically unsustainable given their economic fundamentals. When you see a one-way bet, you take it. Reed leans forward, his confidence emboldened by wine and the comfort of being among peers. George, with all due respect, that sounds like you're giving yourself too much credit. The pound was clearly overvalued. Any decent analyst could see it. You just happened to be in the right place at the right time with enough capital to make a big bet. It was pure luck, really. The table freezes. The casual conversation stops mid-sentence. Glasses pause halfway to lips. Even the waiters serving dessert seem to sense the tension. Reed just called George Soros lucky, to his face. In front of the most powerful men on Wall Street, this is either stupidity or courage, and the distinction isn't immediately clear. Soros doesn't react immediately, doesn't look angry or defensive, just sets down his fork slowly, deliberately, and looks directly at Reed with those sharp grey eyes. The kind of look that has stared down central bank governors and treasury secretaries. The look of a man who has bet billions of his own money on his ability to read human psychology and market dynamics. Marcus, Soros says quietly, his Hungarian accent still present after 30 years in America. May I ask how many currency trades you made in 1992? Reed straightens up, confident in his answer. Hundreds. Apex Capital was very active in currency markets that year. We made excellent profits trading the European crisis. And your largest single position? We went long Deutschmarks against several European currencies, made about 40 million on the trade. 40 million, Soros repeats, nodding thoughtfully. A respectable profit. And you're right that the fundamentals were clear to anyone who cared to look. But let me ask you something else. If it was so obvious, why did you only risk 40 million? Why didn't you bet everything? Reed hesitates. This isn't where he expected the conversation to go. Well, risk management is crucial. You never bet everything on a single trade, no matter how confident you are. That's investing 101. Indeed, Soros agrees. Risk management is crucial. So let me tell you what you're calling luck. On September 15th, I convinced my team to leverage the quantum fund to the maximum. We borrowed an additional $6 billion beyond our capital base. We sold £10 billion short, went long $5 billion in Deutschmarks, and bought another $6 billion in French francs. Our total exposure was larger than our fund's entire assets under management. The table is dead silent. These are sophisticated investors who understand leverage. But what Soros just described goes beyond aggressive. It's insane. The kind of position that destroys funds and ruins careers if it goes wrong. But here's what you missed, Marcus. And this is why you made 40 million while I made $1 billion. You saw the same fundamentals I did, but you didn't understand the psychology. You didn't understand reflexivity. Reed looks confused. Reflexivity. The participants' beliefs affect the outcome, which affects their beliefs, which affects the outcome. Markets aren't just discounting reality, they're creating it. My selling pressure wasn't just exploiting weakness in the pound, it was creating that weakness. Every billion I sold made the Bank of England's position more unstable. Every hour they spent defending the currency cost them reserves they couldn't afford. My attack made their commitment less credible, which attracted other speculators, which made their position even less tenable. Soros picks up his wineglass, takes a small sip, lets his words settle. The room remains absolutely quiet. You see, Marcus, you thought like an analyst. You identified mispricing and made a trade. That's competent. That's professional. That's exactly what they teach at business school. But I thought like a predator. I identified weakness, and then made that weakness fatal. I didn't just bet that the pound would fall, I made sure it would fall. Reed's confidence is starting to crack. This isn't the humble explanation he expected from the old Hungarian. This is something darker, more calculated. But the risk, Soros interrupts gently, is exactly what separated luck from skill. You managed risk by limiting position size. I managed risk by understanding the game. There was no risk in my trade because I had already won before the market opened that Wednesday. I don't understand. Let me explain it to you. Soros leans back in his chair, completely relaxed now, like a teacher who has found an eager student. By September 15th, I had been quietly building my position for weeks, not all at once, but gradually, carefully. I studied every statement from John Major's government. I analysed the Bank of England's foreign currency reserves. I calculated exactly how much pressure they could withstand before their political will broke. The other men around the table are leaning in now, fascinated despite themselves. This isn't the story they thought they knew. The British had committed to keeping the pound above 2.78 marks, but their economy was weakening, their interest rates were too low, and their politicians were more concerned with domestic pressure than exchange rate credibility. I realised something crucial. They weren't just defending an exchange rate, they were defending their political reputation. And reputation, Marcus, is much more fragile than mathematics. So what did you do? I created a test. On September 15th, we dramatically increased our short position, not secretly, but publicly. We made sure the market knew that George Soros was betting heavily against the pound. We wanted the Bank of England to see the pressure. We wanted other investors to know which side we were on. We turned our trade into a public challenge to the British government. Reed is starting to understand, and he doesn't like what he's learning. You forced them to choose between their economics and their politics. Exactly. And politicians always choose politics. By Wednesday morning, they had to choose between raising interest rates to 15%, which would have destroyed their economy, or abandoning the exchange rate mechanism and letting the pound find its natural level. There was no third option. They chose survival. Morrison, who has been silent through this exchange, finally speaks. George, you're describing market manipulation. No, James, I'm describing market reality. The manipulation was the government's attempt to maintain an artificial exchange rate through political willpower. I simply made that manipulation too expensive to continue. The market wanted the pound at 2.4 marks. The government insisted it stay above 2.78. I showed them the cost of fighting economic gravity. Reed makes one last attempt to salvage his position. But you could have been wrong. What if they had raised rates? What if they had found additional reserves? What if other speculators hadn't followed you? Soros smiles for the first time all evening. Not a friendly smile, but the smile of a chess master who has just forced checkmate. Marcus, that's exactly my point. You're still thinking like an analyst, looking for ways the trade could have failed. I was thinking like a strategist, making sure it couldn't fail. He reaches into his jacket pocket, pulls out a small leather notebook, flips to a page marked with a ribbon. Let me read you something I wrote on September 14th, the night before we increased our position. The table is absolutely silent. Soros reads in his careful, accented English. The British government's commitment to the ERM is politically motivated, not economically justified. They joined at the wrong rate, at the wrong time, for the wrong reasons. They are defending the pound not because it's worth defending, but because admitting error would be politically catastrophic. This creates opportunity. Political pressure is temporary. Economic pressure is permanent. When the two conflict, economics always wins. The only question is timing. He closes the notebook, looks directly at Reed. I didn't get lucky, Marcus. I got prepared. I studied the situation until I understood it better than the people creating it. I identified the breaking point and applied precisely the right pressure at precisely the right moment. Then I bet everything because I knew I couldn't lose. And if you had been wrong, then I would have deserved to lose everything. But I wasn't wrong, was I? And that's the difference between us, Marcus. You diversify because you're uncertain. I concentrated my position because I was certain. Reed shifts uncomfortably. Certainty is dangerous in markets. Uncertainty is what's dangerous, Soros interrupts. I spent 6 months studying the European exchange rate mechanism before I took my position. By the time I acted, uncertainty wasn't an option. Bradford leans forward. George, how do you distinguish between confidence and overconfidence? The difference, William, is in the quality of your preparation. I wasn't confident about shorting the pound. I was certain it would fall, because I understood why it had to fall. He takes another sip of wine. I knew that Norman Lamont had approximately £27 billion in reserves. I knew defending the exchange rate cost them $2 billion per day. I knew that John Major's government couldn't afford massive interest rate increases. I knew German reunification was driving up German rates. The precision is stunning. Reed realizes that while he saw the basic trade, Soros saw it in granular detail. But most importantly, I knew something about human psychology. Politicians will sacrifice economic logic for political survival every time. Lamont and Major weren't defending an exchange rate, they were defending their reputations. Morrison speaks up. George, what you're describing sounds like targeting the British government. Not personally, James. Strategically. The British had made a policy error. My job as an investor isn't to make their lives easier, it's to profit from their mistakes while forcing quick correction. Reed makes one final attempt. But you profited from their pain. I profited from their error, Marcus. If I hadn't forced the issue, someone else would have eventually. The exchange rate was mathematically unsustainable. The silence stretches for 30 seconds. Reed has no response. Around the table, some of the most powerful investors in America are processing what they just heard. This wasn't a trade, it was a campaign. Not luck strategy. Not gambling warfare conducted with currency positions instead of armies. Bradford clears his throat. George, what you're describing sounds almost vindictive. Not vindictive, William. Practical. I learned during the war that survival depends on understanding power better than the people who wield it. The British had power, political power, institutional power, the power of tradition and credibility, but they didn't understand the limits of that power. I did. Morrison pours himself another glass of wine. His hands are slightly shaky. You're talking about bringing down governments. I'm talking about correcting government mistakes before they destroy more wealth. The British were spending billions defending an indefensible position. Every day they continued cost their taxpayers money and delayed inevitable adjustment. I provided a service. I made the inevitable happen quickly instead of slowly. Reed has been quiet for 2 minutes, processing everything he's heard. Finally, he speaks. So, when you say there was no risk in the trade, I mean exactly that. By the time we put on the full position, the outcome was determined. The British couldn't win because they were fighting mathematics with politics. Politicians can suspend economic laws temporarily, but eventually the laws reassert themselves. I simply calculated when eventually would arrive, and made $1 billion doing it. Made $1 billion, proved a theory, and taught central bankers around the world that artificial exchange rates carry real costs, not a bad day's work. The evening winds down slowly. Dessert is served but barely touched. Cognac is poured but left unfinished. The conversation never quite recovers its earlier lightness. Reed speaks little for the rest of the dinner, clearly processing the implications of what he's learned. As the evening ends, Reed approaches Soros privately. George, I owe you an apology. I thought I understood what you did, but I was measuring it by the wrong standard. What standard were you using? Normal trading, risk-adjusted returns, academic theory about market efficiency, and now? Now I understand you weren't trading, you were teaching. Teaching the market, teaching governments, teaching everyone who thought political will could override economic reality. Soros nods. The market is a voting machine in the short run, Marcus, but a weighing machine in the long run. I just helped it weigh the pound correctly. The impact of that dinner conversation ripples through Wall Street faster than anyone expected. Within days, Reed finds himself replaying Soros's words over and over. He starts questioning everything he thought he knew about markets, about risk, about the nature of successful investing. 3 weeks after the dinner, Reed receives a package with no return address. Inside is a book, The Alchemy of Finance by George Soros. On the first page, someone has written in careful handwriting, Marcus, understanding reflexivity is the difference between making money and making history. G.S. 6 months later, Reed restructures his entire approach to investing. He stops making hundreds of small trades and starts looking for the few trades where he can develop genuine conviction. Most importantly, he changes how he thinks about risk. Before the dinner, risk meant volatility and position size. After the dinner, risk means being wrong about something fundamental. When the technology bubble bursts in 2000, Reed's fund profits massively because he recognized the reflexive patterns Soros taught him about. His returns that year exceed 40% while most hedge funds lose money. Reed proves to himself that he learned the real lesson. Understanding comes before positioning. Conviction comes before capital allocation. 20 years later, Reed gives a speech at the same union club where his education began. He tells young hedge fund managers about the night he learned that genius looks like luck only to people who don't understand preparation. He describes the difference between trading and investing, between activity and achievement, between being smart and being wise. The truth about that dinner spreads through Wall Street like wildfire. Not the details, those remain confidential among club members, but the lesson. George Soros didn't get lucky. He got smarter than everyone else in the room, including the people who thought they understood his trades. The story becomes legendary. The night a billionaire hedge fund manager called George Soros lucky, and Soros responded by explaining exactly how he had outthought the Bank of England. 5 minutes that changed how an entire generation of investors thought about the relationship between preparation and opportunity. Because that's what George Soros taught that October evening in 1995. Luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity, but genius is what happens when you create the opportunity yourself. Reed learned that night that he had been confusing motion with progress, trading with investing, analysis with understanding. Soros showed him the difference between making money and making history, between getting rich and getting legendary. That's the real story of Black Wednesday. Not just a profitable trade, but a masterpiece of strategic thinking. Not just market timing, but market creation. Not luck, but the inevitable result of understanding human psychology better than the humans making the decisions. 5 minutes at a dinner table, one question about luck versus skill, one answer that revealed the difference between gambling and calculated genius. The night Marcus Reed discovered that he had been playing checkers while George Soros was playing chess,